Okay, folks. So, hey, we are into our last bit on African Americans in the United States. This is going to be a two-parter. First, we're going to cover the end of slavery up until the Civil Rights era, and then we'll move into post-civil rights and the rise of mass incarceration towards the concept and movement of Black Lives Matter. There will be a few videos, and this is going to be a little bit more history like we've been covering last time with the the antebellum period. As always, there's going to be some discussions of violence, so I always want to be cognizant of that in terms of trigger warnings. So just know that I'll be available. All of these materials will be posted online, so if you have any questions, feel free to always contact me, and then we can have schedule some office hours times or other types of or another type of medium or meeting medium, so that way we can discuss these materials. So with that, let's get started. So we're going to cover quite a bit in this lecture, only because there is a multitude of issues in history within this time frame. Obviously, this is not exhaustive, and I'm trying to infuse what I think are some critical historical points that are not covered as intensely or as with depth in mainstream U.S. history. A couple things that we want to note with the post-antebellum period is that it didn't necessarily mean the end of race relations, rather that it was an evolution of the concepts of race and race thinking. This was discussed a lot, if you'll remember back to the racial formations video with Tim Wise on the discussion of white privilege and the formation of the white race. So you're going to see a lot of that kind of discussion here in terms of the evolution of slavery and how that didn't necessarily go away. So we're going to talk about the end of the Civil War and new race politics, the history of Reconstruction, new race relations under Jim Crow, examples of Black codes and vagrancy laws, new slavery through the convict leasing system, factors leading to the civil rights movement, and then the civil rights movement itself. There are three major key terms that I want to focus on this time around. This idea of Jim Crow laws, which were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation, named after a Black minstrel show character. The laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying the right to vote, hold jobs, and get an education or other opportunities. Black codes, which were also under the Jim Crow kind of framework, were strict state and local laws that when, were, and how formerly enslaved people could work and for how much they were compensated. These codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put citizens into indentured servitude, to take away voting rights, and to control where they lived and how they traveled, and seize children for labor purposes. Lastly, civil rights are a class of rights that protect individuals' freedoms from infringement by government, social organizations, and private individuals. They ensure one's entitlement to participate in the civil and political life of society or of a society and the state without discrimination or repression. So the end of the Civil War brought about a new type of race politic. It wasn't that we just had this kumbaya moment between the North and the South, but rather we had a movement towards trying to reconcile the differences between the two. And if you remember back to the lecture from last time, a lot of the tension between the two sides, the North and the South, was about economics. It was really centered on who should have governing power, who should be able to amass wealth, and what was the role of slavery in all of that, right? Because slavery was basically the way in which the South was able to amass a huge amount of wealth, and the US government's desire to regulate and or end slavery was starting to cause severe tensions as we saw other economic instability going on, particularly with poor whites. So at this time, we officially end slavery, and Lincoln pushes a new system of race relations on the US. Remember that he didn't necessarily support full equality for whites and blacks, right? And that was evinced in the statement that I showed in terms of the long legacy of racial politics from Thomas Jefferson to Strom Thurmond, where he clearly states that he believes that there is a difference between the two races, and that he wants or is in favor of whites being assigned to the superior racial position over African Americans or blacks, right? And so this healing now had to deal with a lot of these existing racial and racist sentiments. Mind you that in 1865, we're seeing almost, for the most part, 300 years of slavery in the US, right? Whether you take into account the fact that slave systems had existed in early America from 1492 or the 1500s up until 1865, there had already been a long legacy and history of racist thought, or this construction of racial difference, but for the explicit purpose of casting communities of color as inferior for the purposes of exploitation, enslavement, or eradication. And so just because we had the Civil War happen, and just because the segregationists or the quote unquote racist side lost, did not mean that racist sentiments went away. And what I would stress on that point is that the Northerners were not necessarily in favor of equality for African Americans. It was just that they didn't want to have slavery continued in the United States for ethical reasons and for economic reasons, right? So this wasn't just necessarily a reconciliation, but rather had to go through this long, kind of arduous process of what we know as Reconstruction, which I'll cover in a second, to bring the South and the North back together. And then in that process, we had a new sense of race relations emerge, or new sentiments about race and racism emerge in that new time. So Reconstruction and the new constitutional laws about race basically were focused on trying to bring about equality for African Americans, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was causing equality or leading to equality, right? So the Reconstruction era began shortly after the Civil War. It lasts for about 10 years, a little over that, roughly about 12. Its main purposes were to integrate the South into national governing processes, shift away from slavery economies, focusing on free labor and industrialization, and protect newly integrated free Black people. There was actually an entire governmental institution, or a new agency developed, called the Freedmen's Bureau, and it was established to provide African Americans with food, shelter, and work, as they realized that these individuals had no resources, essentially, despite being free. And that's one thing that we need to always keep in mind when we think about the conditions of African Americans in the United States, is that for, again, 300 or even 150 years, let's say, or 100, about 100 years, right? So if we pause at the beginning of formal slavery in the United States at 1776, when we break off from independence and ratify our Constitution, right? From that time until 1865, African Americans in the United States had no standing at all. And at that point, they become free with no economic resources or ties. And mind you, right, this is 1865, so there isn't formalized systems of social welfare or other kinds of programs to integrate these folks. And so you basically, freed them, or, let them off the shackles and said, have at it, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to set them up for success. The Freedmen's Bureau was meant to do some of this, right? There was this idea that they were supposed to get 48% a mule upon, release from slavery, although many scholars have noted that that never actually happened. And actually, we've seen a lot of evidence growing. And if you've been following the story of Bruce's Beach, which was in Manhattan Beach, there was actually a lot of theft of Black land. Bruce's Beach is a primary example here in Los Angeles, or in the LA County region, where valuable property in Manhattan Beach, was stolen from Black folks and given away, or stolen from Black folks, and then essentially given to or used by whites, despite having that. And there's tons and tons of examples of that for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for Native Americans, and for Latinos, where they've been pushed out due to eminent domain or had their lands outright stolen by white private citizens, so on and so forth, which has really hamstrung their ability to gain that economics. And if we think about, I'll move on after this last point, but if we think about the fact that the United States was able to accrue or make essentially 10 to 12 trillion, and trillion with a T, dollars from African American labor. This isn't just accounting for the land that was stolen, but just from the labor. We have to assume that the value of money or the amount of money that was taken from African Americans is far higher, right? And so when we consider the current state of economics and the enduring legacy of slavery, which we'll cover over this next unit, right, we can better understand the general conditions of African Americans in the United States and why it has been so difficult for them to find equality, and also consider the fact that the US has never made meaningful steps to even ensure their equality, right? So some of the more general attempts on trying to get African Americans equality was through three major post-slavery or Reconstruction era laws. One was the 13th Amendment, which we talked a little bit about, and that was just the abolition of slavery. However, there's a caveat to that, right? Because the idea that we abolished slavery was only the fact that we abolished slavery for private purposes, right? So I cannot buy you as a slave. And this idea of chattel slavery at this point had gone away, right? However, you could be enslaved as punishment for a crime. And what we'll learn about in a second is that this was a system that did endure for many years. The 14th Amendment guaranteed birthright citizenship to all folks, right? And protections against state laws that infringed on citizens' rights. And so this was meant to ensure that African American children born after slavery could still be given US citizenship rights, that they wouldn't be denied that on the basis of their race. And then we were also seeing more and more immigrants at the time, and we were seeing we were also settling lands to the west with natives and Mexicans, or now Mexican Americans, being incorporated into the society. So we didn't want to have their children not be granted citizenship and denied those rights and protections. Lastly, we had the 15th Amendment that protected voting rights for racial minorities and formerly enslaved people. So the 14th and 15th Amendment, I think, are the two that should be a bit striking. The fact that we had to have one law that already set up a framework to protect against discrimination or infringement on citizen rights by states. And then we had to go further by saying, look, you actually need to ensure that folks have the right to vote, right? Because of the history of this discriminatory policies that have made it very difficult for African Americans to access equal voting, so on and so forth, right? So Reconstruction, like I said, is very short-lived, and there's a couple of different factors for this. One is many of the presidents that came after Lincoln did not do enough work to push forward a progressive civil rights agenda. I frankly never actualized, freed American or African Americans' freedom in the U.S. And it started essentially with the assassination of Lincoln, but was definitely exacerbated by other factors. One was that in the 1870s we had a huge depression in the U.S., not the Great Depression, right, of the 1920s, but a large economic recession. And that distracted the U.S. government from Reconstruction efforts, right? So they were too busy trying to deal with the economic problems to deal with the integration problems. The South was continuously trying to fight and keep races separated, and again maintain these racial hierarchies. So even though there was the Freedmen Bureau and there were other things going on, we still never saw the South do the work of trying to integrate those folks, and it was largely because they wanted to maintain that racial caste system. And then lastly, when President Hayes is elected in the later 1970s, it's a very contested election. and there's a lot of allegations of voting fraud. And so the Republicans of the time decide that they are going to pull troops out of the South who had been protecting the rights of African Americans. And this led to a kind of perfect storm, or a perfect scenario where the South was able to not only, or Southerners, I should say, were able to not only reenact a lot of racist laws, but actually re-perpetrate a lot of the racism of the past that they had been doing. So this next clip that I'm going to show you is going to explain a little bit more of this in terms of the background of these particular law, or this transition.
At the beginning of Reconstruction, there was a tremendous federal will to both bring the South into submission after a civil war has been fought against the South. So is about war and politics, but also to protect African Americans. And part of this is really about the protection of African American civil rights. So the Reconstruction Congress passes a whole bevy of civil rights acts trying to protect African Americans, gives a lot of enforcement power to what is still a pretty small federal bureaucracy and federal law enforcement apparatus, but Congress makes some efforts. And then a number of things happen in the 1870s and the 1880s that make these efforts at enforcement fail in large part. Part of it is economic depressions. In 1876, there's a big economic depression and people's energies move elsewhere. So that's part of it, is that Congress becomes interested in what's going on in the North, in financial panics and in depressions, and is not quite as interested in protecting African American rights. Part of it is about politics. The election of 1876 is very contested, and there's a compromise made between the North and the South that includes the removal of federal troops from the South. Now, if you think about it, there have been federal troops in the South since 1865, when the Civil War ended, and the removal of troops is huge, right? Who is it who's going to protect African American rights in the South, if not the Army and the federal military? So the removal of troops is a big part of it. But then another big part of it is that we have a system in which different branches of the federal government exercise different kinds of power. So Congress passes these laws, and the country ratifies the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And there's one vision of what those are supposed to do. And that's a vision of dramatically increased federal power over the states. Before the Civil War, at the founding of the country, when the Constitution is first written, people are really afraid of federal governmental power. It reminds them of King George and England, and they think the states are going to protect people's rights. And at the end of the Civil War, the federal government thinks to itself, states don't look like they're going to protect the rights of African Americans in the South. We need to create greater federal power.
Okay. So again, we have this kind of perfect storm of new competing factors along existing conundrums in the US, right? This idea that we were going to have states' rights, that we didn't want to have a large federal control system in place, the realization that the states weren't going to do what they needed to do. And, because of this history of racism, right? And then the sheer fact that clearly they weren't doing that. And after troops withdraw from the area, from the South specifically, we do see a quick resurgence of this overt racism. The Klan, or the Ku Klux Klan, right, emerges as a new kind of political movement and ideological movement to reify racism and race relations and racism in the United States. It's one of the longest standing domestic terrorist organizations in the US, right? We have no other organization like that in existence here in the US that advances a race politic. And I know that the Klan seems a bit out there in terms of its, I don't want to say this, the Klan is a bit out there in terms of how present it is in the US, but let me tell you that it is clear. David Duke, who was discussed during the Trump presidency and the Trump candidacy, is still around. He was a Grand Wizard of the largest chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1990s. He ran for governor. There was a report put out by the FBI talking about the presence of white supremacists and Klansmen in various law enforcement organizations. And there's been numerous cases of law enforcement agents in a variety of different capacities being affiliated with supremacist organizations or the Klan specifically. And so this reality is very present, and it leads to a kind of nefarious issue that becomes a part of the American experience of race. So what ends up emerging after the fall of Reconstruction is this rise of what are called the Jim Crow era or Black Codes, right? And so essentially, we went back to the same framework of African Americans at the bottom, right? And all people of color being assigned a similar position, essentially, and then whites being on top. Jim Crow, essentially, like I said, was a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. And it was meant to just marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, to hold jobs, to get an education or other opportunities, right? And it's very important that we understand that Jim Crow encompassed so many of these different capacities, because I think, again, like with race and racism in the United States, it's talked about within this interpersonal framework. I don't like you, and therefore and it can be cured, I should say, by educating that away, or those folks just going away, right? And it's actually much more entrenched, and these laws, were in place for almost 100 years. It took many activist movements from that time until the 1960s to really push those away. What then emerged was this idea of the Black Codes, and if you haven't heard about this term or this concept, don't worry about it. But what was nefarious about Jim Crow laws was the emergence of these Black Codes. And Black Codes were essentially just laws that were out there that criminalized all Black behavior, from walking on the side of the street, interracial socializing, and or romantic / sexual fraternizing, not being able to prove you were employed, being drunk, a variety of things. And what these did was it provided an opportunity for state officials to essentially arrest African Americans for any reason. And in doing so, I put them back into the system of slavery, because again, if you are convicted of a crime, you can be re-enslaved, right? And just be kind of sold out by the state. So this next video clip will explain a little bit deeper, and I'll give a bit more context afterwards.
And they were. Between emancipation in 1874, this is a period of a great deal of violence, uncertainty, and conflict in the South. There's no other way to describe the Reconstruction era, but really on a local, this is all about conflicts over independence and equality between Blacks and whites. And the legal system plays an important role in this. The Black Codes were taken from the old slave codes, and these were laws that were meant to apply solely to Black people. And they were laws that made it a crime, again, to be out after a certain hour, for possessing a weapon of any kind. Vagrancy was one. Let's say you had a skill as a slave. You wanted to be a barber, or you wanted to have your own shop, or even if a Black woman wanted to be a laundress, you had to have a permit. And you had to pay money to get that permit. And if you were operating without a permit, you could be arrested under the Black Codes. These laws varied from state to state, but they all had the same purpose, which was to subject the freed people to their own particular kinds of control. you have people being arrested on charges from the Black codes and put to work on the streets. And this is before the big convict leasing system emerges. These are all local laws. If you're arrested for vagrancy, if you're arrested for theft, if you're arrested for larceny, these are tried in local courts. These are not tried in federal courts. These are tried in local courts. There is actually very little that the federal government can do to intervene in these kinds of situations. That this was really a tool that was used to keep Blacks in fear and also to curtail their independence. It's very common in newspapers, local county newspapers, for the press to describe who is in the local jail. And they'll say 73 in the Dallas County Jail, all Negro. So many people arrested for theft, all Negro. Now, these were meant to convey an idea that former slaves were inherently criminal. But what they really show is that whites didn't have to worry about the power of the law when it came to their behavior. It's inevitable that the combination of the legacy of slavery and the power placed in the hands of whites, these laws are going to be disproportionately used against Black people, and they were.
And so what this eventually led to was this huge system of what we now know as convict leasing. And so, or sorry, I was going to give some examples of this. So here are provided two Black codes from Mississippi. I'll give you a general summary, but please feel free to read over these in more detail. But essentially, be it further that all freedmen, Negroes, or mulattoes, which are again kind of a mix between whites and Blacks in the state over the age of 18, right, should need to have employment, or with no employment, right, but with a white person, can essentially be convicted, right, of a crime, be charged $150, right, and then be imprisoned at the discretion of a court. The freed Negro not exceeding 10 days, the white man not exceeding 6 days, right? And so here we can see disproportionate treatment. We can see obviously the fact that although it's a bit more expensive in terms of the fine for a white man versus a Negro, or versus a African American or a Black person, right? There's a disproportionality in terms of the stay in jail for not having work, essentially. And then if you see here on this line here, it says freedmen, freed Negroes or mulattoes, or usually associating with freedmen, Negroes, or mulattoes on terms of equality, or living in adultery or fornication with freed women, freed Negroes, right, she'll be deemed vagrants, right? And that's the operative term in a lot of us, is this idea of vagrant. And then in the sense that they can be seen as not working, right, or just in this kind of free association with other individuals, right, can be seen as vagrant, and obviously be fined and convicted or incarcerated as a result of that. This second law says that, be it further enacted, that all fines and forfeitures collected under the provisions of this act shall be paid to the county treasurer and general county purposes. And in any case, any freed man, free Negro, or free mulatto shall fail for 5 days. Fail for 5 days after the imprisonment, and any fine for forfeiture upon him or her of the violation of any provision of the act, pay the same, and it shall be and is hereby made the duty of the sheriff or the property of hire freeman, blah, 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 or any person for the shortest period of time of service, pay said fine or all costs. And I know that's kind of very jargonistic, but essentially, if you can't pay your fine, they're going to allow you to work your fine off, right? So if you get arrested for vagrancy, you are given the option, quote unquote, to be worked, or the state will assign you work to ensure that you pay this off. And again, this is a very elaborate way to assign criminality or vagrancy to individuals because they were deemed not working or in free association with others. And as a result, you could be arrested, convicted, and then, re-enslaved as a result. Here's an example from South Carolina. in terms of apprenticeship, orphans and children of poor and destitute parents in South Carolina Code could authorize, or the South Carolina Code, authorize the court to assign apprenticeship to these children who are either orphans or, children of poor and destitute parents until they were 21. So they, would have to essentially leave their family and live with a white till 21 for male and 18 for females. Masters had the right to inflict moderate punishment on their apprentices or to recapture runaways. So if you were, again, an orphan or a poor child deemed by the state, right, you could be taken from your family or be given to a white master. That master could punish you with moderate physical punishment, right, and recapture you if you ran away. The code also required masters to provide food, clothing, and apprentices to teach them a trade or send them to school. So there was some caveats in terms of taking care of the children, but essentially you could enslave these children with no recourse, right? Essentially, you just needed to give them food and shelter, and say that you were teaching them a trade. In terms of labor contracts, a lot of work during this time was centered around labor contracts. So you would enter into a contract with an employer. They would set the terms of this, how long you work, how many days you would work, so on and so forth. I want to read this one a bit more carefully because I want you to kind of hear the essence of what this law really did. I'm going to start from this second line here with Black servants. So Black servants had to reside on the employer's property, remain quiet and orderly, work from sunup to sunset except on Sundays, and not leave the premises or receive visitors without the master's permission. Masters could moderately whip servants under 18 to discipline them. Whipping older servants required a judge's order. Time lost due to illness would be deducted from the servant's wages. Servants who quit before the end date of their labor contract forfeited their wages and could be arrested and returned to their masters by a judge's order. And so these two laws in the South basically made it possible for you to capture, children or Black children and create these labor contracts with older or adult Black people and force them to reside on your property, right? Allow you to beat them if you wanted to, only needing just a judge's orders with regard to labor contracts, and essentially control everything about you. So in both of these situations, it's essentially slavery again. It's just not set as such, right? It's all about control. It's all about labor, and the terms of your labor and the terms of your stay are defined not by yourself, but actually by the master who controls you, which is obviously in this case a white person. And this is when I've been mentioning this evolution of slavery and race relations. This is how we can see this kind of happen, right? What we're seeing is this evolution of, here is this demoralized African American or African descendant person or Afro descendant person made to feel inferior or made to be seen as inferior for the purposes of exploitation. We no longer rely on that system, and so we've moved on to it. However, what we've done is just basically change the language. Well, we're not saying that you're 3/5 of a person anymore, but you essentially don't have any freedom and rights under these contractual and legal frameworks. We're not saying that you're 3/5 a person, but you still don't have the ability to control yourself or to set your terms of work and life under these laws, right? And what we'll see next time is how this has evolved into the new system of mass incarceration. So this short video is going to give a bit more detail on the convict leasing system, and I'll give a bit more depth on this.
Buried in old courthouses, abandoned jails, libraries, and archives all across the South are tens of thousands of public documents and letters written by African Americans at the turn of the last century.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree and they've been working him in prison for 12 months. He's done nothing wrong for them to keep him in chains.
Written more than 40 years after the Emancipation Proclamation These letters bear witness to a sinister and little-known chapter in American history.
Whenever one is in a conversation where someone says, what's wrong with Black people? Why can't they get over it? Slavery ended 150 years ago. That's fundamentally false. The reality is that slavery and all of the limitations that it imposed on the future and potential and the progress of African American families, it didn't end 150 years ago. It continued until World War II, well into the lives of large numbers of African Americans today.
For more than 80 years following the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South were pulled back into the shadow of slavery.
Buying and selling African Americans ended with the 13th Amendment. That did not translate into actual freedom.
One of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime.
With emancipation, the nature of both crime and punishment in the South changed dramatically. In state after state, county after county, laws were passed to criminalize Black life.
It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark. But the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statute. In every Southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
Once arrested, convicts were released and forced to labor in coal mines, lumber camps, brick factories, and turpentine farms. They were shackled, imprisoned, and tortured, sometimes to the point of death.
The fact that Blacks were treated the way they were, like animals. People could be just picked up and put in jail. They could be lost in the system. Nobody knew how to find them. They could be buried in some grave somewhere and families still looking for them. Don't know where they are. I didn't know that the sheriff department could sell slaves to corporations, steel plants, and coal mines.
The constant threat of arrest and forced labor, like the threat of lynching, cast a shadow over the South. Slavery had ended, but true freedom had not begun.
And so what this clip tells us is that this system eventually became the new, slave system, right? And one of the things that I want to be very clear about with the rise of convict leasing in the U.S., it was more prominent in the South, but it was practiced throughout parts of the United States, is that convict leasing provided a new way to treat African Americans. I didn't decide to provide it in this presentation, but scholars have noted that the death rate and the death toll from convict leasing was much higher compared to slavery or to conventional chattel slavery. And that was in part because with chattel slavery, you didn't want to lose your investment, right? I didn't want to lose the money that I had paid for a slave, like with losing money for a piece of livestock that I had purchased, right? I wanted to care for that animal or care for that person because I wanted them to have maximized output. What we noticed, or what scholars noticed and historians have noted with convict leasing, was that the sense that these folks were criminal and that there was such a ubiquitous system that was constantly replenishing African Americans, as laborers to the pool, essentially, was that it allowed for much harsher treatment towards these individuals. And so we saw a much higher torture and death rate in the convict leasing system compared to the chattel slavery system. And I think that's what also informs a lot of the ways in which prisoners and quote unquote criminals are treated today. If we think about how African Americans or criminals are treated in both contexts, we want to realize that the dehumanization is actually accelerated at this point, right? That they're no longer just slaves, that they're actually slaves and criminals, right? So that's a twofold context. And their criminality allows for or enables this new understanding of their lack of or their humanity. And because of that, right, because they've now transgressed social norms, we can just torture and beat them. However, and lynching is much more prominent in the South in the Reconstruction era, I would argue, compared to the chattel slavery period, because although, yes, we did use physical punishment as a means to correct, I shouldn't say correct, but to control and teach African Americans and slaves their place. The convict leasing system relied heavily on the incarceration of individuals, and those that transgress, would be incarcerated in mass or just, outright killed for the same reasons, but at a much higher rate, because we needed to, or I shouldn't say we, but the American society of the time really wanted to impose upon this idea that African Americans, although free, were not equal, right? That there was this inequality. This inequality was going to be maintained, and it was evinced through or shown through the sense that you were going to be arrested for basically anything and re-enslaved, or you could be lynched at any point in time, and that taught others, quote unquote, how to act, right? So here's some examples of convict leasing. So these are different labor camps. So here you see some farm workers up on the top. You see some folks breaking rail lines here down on the bottom. These are bounties for folks that were in this system. You can see that they're somewhere between $700 to $500 rewards. Obviously, race is a big part of this, right? So color, mulatto, right? Color, mulatto. And this was big business, right? So there were bounty hunters out there searching for these folks that were collecting, bounties for either folks that had escaped from their contracts or their labor contracts, or escaped from this convict system. And the businesses themselves were huge. Part of the the interstate highway system was developed by slave labor during the 1920s and 30s and 40s. We also saw this heavily helping with the railroad system and mining and agriculture during the time. And so, again, we never really fully departed from slavery. We never really fully departed from race relations. Rather, just evolved, right? It transformed into what we know today as this kind of racial caste system that is always continuously denying the full rights and privileges of African Americans. And so what this led to, especially in the turn of the 20th century, was what we now know as the Great Migration. And so the Great Migration was a huge exodus of African Americans from the U.S. In two particular waves. One from 1915 to the 1940s, and then again from 1940 until the 1970s. There's estimates that about 6 million African Americans left to the northern Midwest and East, as well as parts of the West Coast, from the historic southern states. And this was primarily due to the fact that there was still a lot of racial hostility and racist violence, and then obviously a lack of economic opportunity in the Reconstruction era. What it provided you here on the top is a map that really shows that exodus. So here is the kind of beltway of the original southern states that heavily had slavery. You can see a lot of folks moving to the north, into the Northeast, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, parts of the New England regions, into that conventional Midwest, Chicago, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, so on and so forth, parts of Colorado, parts of Arizona, parts of California, parts of Oregon and Washington. And so although we had huge concentrations of African Americans here, we start to see these microcausal populations start to pick up, right? Namely, for example, how we have there was a huge African American community in Oakland and in parts of South Central Los Angeles, right? Right around our doorstep, Long Beach, LA, South Central, so on and so forth. And it's largely due in part to this huge exodus from these areas that have this legacy of racial violence. here, this small video clip on the Great Migration is going to give a bit more detail about that.
In the 19 teens and 20s, a large number of African Americans moved from the South to other parts of the country. Why did they move? What kind of impact did this have on the nation? In 1900, most African Americans in the United States lived in southern states. In fact, 90% of the African American population still lived in the South. However, many began to move into northern and Midwestern states, such as Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York. The reasons they were moving varied from family to family. In cases, they were hoping to find jobs in steel mills, automobile factories, meat packing plants, or working for the railroad. Some were searching for better schools and education opportunities. Others were hoping to escape the racism and violence that African Americans were experiencing in the South. Most who left the South were heading for larger northern cities. Chicago, New York City, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland all experienced significant surges in population. For example, in 1910, the African American population of Detroit was approximately 6,000. By 1930, this number had increased to 120,000. Nationwide, only an estimated 740,000 African Americans lived outside of the South in 1900. As the 20th century progressed, this number eventually rose to more than 10 million living in other regions of the country. The Great Migration was one of the largest and fastest movements ever by a group of people who were moving from one part of a nation to another. This is especially true when considering that the movement was not caused by some kind of immediate threat or danger. This migration had many different ramifications for the nation. As Black populations rose, many northern cities became increasingly more integrated. African Americans were working alongside recent European immigrants, as well as other white residents. These cities also became important centers for African American culture. Newspapers, churches, businesses, and political organizations were all established by African Americans as part of a movement to redefine Black culture. Harlem became the center of much of this activity. Musicians, artists, and writers flocked to the area, bringing about the era that would eventually become known as the Harlem Renaissance. There were also some negative impacts of the Great Migration. Many African Americans who moved north did experience racism in their new cities. In some neighborhoods, white residents moved away, having no desire to live with Black neighbors. This resulted in some places, such as Harlem, having an almost exclusively Black population. Obviously, another significant impact of the Great Migration was the changing demographics of the South. Every southern state experienced a loss in African American population, especially in the rural regions. African Americans made up more than 50% of the populations in both Mississippi and South Carolina. Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia had populations that were more than 40% Black. Within just a few decades, these numbers would be reduced to less than 30% in nearly every one of those states.
So the Great Migration becomes a part of a huge cultural phenomenon that happens at this time where essentially, again, millions of African Americans leave the South and redefine much of the US, right? If you think about it this way, the migration north to Harlem with the Great Renaissance, the movement north to Harlem by African Americans leads to the Harlem Renaissance, and actually in many ways gives rise to what we now know as hip hop, right, in that region, right? The existing African American, Latino and some other immigrant communities that were living in that area during the 1980s, gave rise to this sense of injustice, and it created a new lyrical music form that became rap, right? Their movement north to Detroit created Motown and a lot of the jazz and blues that we know today. There's new types of blues and other types of rock and roll that emerged because of the Great Migration as folks move to these various areas. And so just a major impact in terms of all that. What I do want to know, obviously, with this clip is that although African Americans did move to these regions and move to these regions to escape a lot of the racism that they were experiencing in the South, they didn't necessarily, they experienced it also in the North. It wasn't that they moved to these places and things changed, rather that it basically was the same situation, just a new region, right? Okay. So this kind of creates a situation where we have various factors that are going to eventually lead to the civil rights movement. So in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s, we are continuously seeing issues in the US. Segregation becomes kind of rampant throughout the US. There are various laws and other policies in place that are ensuring that blacks and whites don't live together. Anti-miscegenation laws prevented interracial marriages, so there was a clear legal framework saying that blacks and whites should not intermix, and that we should keep the races separated. And then there was rampant racist violence and race riots throughout the U.S. To show this a little bit further, or to elaborate a bit more on this, I showed this large map from the 1950s on various states that had laws or basically allowed segregation to happen. So the states in yellow had no laws on segregation one way or the other. They basically just allowed for a kind of go as the flow or laissez-faire kind of framework. Those in orange allowed segregation in some places, and then the ones in red actually had actual segregation by law. So again, most of the United States either allowed, encouraged, or just didn't really care whether or not folks were segregated. And this is when we still only had 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska were not official states at this time. But what we can see is that clearly most of the states allowed for segregation. The blue states are the states that actually did not allow segregation by law, right? Just below that, I show what were called Black massacres over the time from basically 1870s until the 1920s. And what we can see is that there's numerous instances of these race riots. One that came to light very recently and has been discussed in mass is the Tulsa, Oklahoma riot that killed numerous African Americans. I believe about $5 million worth of property was destroyed. Several thousand people were harmed. Many individuals had died as a result of that. And I'm sorry for putting a bit here. So yeah, essentially 100 were injured, 60 were killed, and many were left in the streets, right? Churches and buildings were destroyed. Damage estimated about $5 million. So this is a newspaper clipping talking about the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot that happened in 1921. There was a huge one in St. Louis in 1917. Here we can see 100 Negroes shot, burned, clubbed to death in St. Louis race war. And so this is all happening while there are supposedly laws in place, and there's this framework essentially to bring about the inclusion of African Americans. What's most striking about this is that as African Americans are serving and working in their communities, and many of them are going off to fight in wars, because remember, World War One happens at this time. There's a huge draft. World War II also happens. There's a huge draft, and many African Americans serve the country. There still really isn't any meaningful change happening nor inclusion. And what Blacks are coming to realize is it doesn't really matter where they move or what they do. It's really that America is not going to see them as equal, and they have to take dramatic action to obviously change that. And so we have the civil rights movement, right? So African American Black rights emerged to contest, the historic mistreatment of the community. Leaders are hoping to end lynching or extralegal killing, which again, I want to ensure that we have this kind of comprehensive understanding that lynching is not just about, strangling somebody to death, but really this framework of extralegal killing, which has still been a persistent struggle. We still do not have a federal anti-lynching law. There are states that have some of these laws, but it is not kind of commonly known or commonly banned in the United States, right? So there are, it's still technically, legal, or it's not considered to be an outright crime to lynch folks, although it's still considered to be murder. End to de jure or by law racial segregation in military service, right? Housing, schools, public facilities, stores, and restaurants. And this is really big because segregation was not just like, we don't want you living in our neighborhoods. It was widespread through all aspects of society. And it was obviously legalized, as I had shown in the previous slide. So that was very big, and what was seen to be one of the hugest hindrances for African Americans in terms of having social and economic mobility and stability, but also the ability to move into or to find equality with whites. And then lastly, to end voting for disenfranchisement, which included literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. So these were various laws that prevented African Americans from voting. Literacy tests would always, ensure that they could actually read and write. Poll taxes were another mechanism for ensuring that African Americans could not afford to vote. And then if you're not familiar with grandfather clauses, there was always a framework where if your ancestor was a slave, you could be denied the right to vote based upon that genealogical history. Movements across the US then push lawmakers to pass new civil rights legislations and protections to protect their communities, right, from all of these various forms of discrimination. And so this understanding of civil rights emerged as this kind of class of rights that protected that protect individual freedom from infringement by government, social organizations, and private individuals, right? So that you cannot be denied access to certain things by, your race, whether that be by businesses, by, various social organizations, or the government itself, right? Basically civil rights were to ensure people had the entitlement to participate in civil and political life without discrimination or repression based upon their race, class, gender, sexuality, so on and so forth, right? So that's pretty much where we leave off today. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about civil rights next time, and especially in terms of the fall of the civil rights movement. But we saw how the Civil War kind of gave rise to a new race politic, especially since the Civil War did not end the notions of racism present in the United States. We saw that kind of history of Reconstruction, new race relations under Jim Crow, examples of the Black Codes, and this emergence of the convict leasing system. And then lastly, the factors that were leading up to the civil rights, and then obviously the civil rights movement itself. Now, I know I didn't get into the particulars and the weeds on the civil rights era. However, we are pretty cognizant of what that looked like, right? Between the fact that there were, numerous marches throughout the United States trying to advance or to advocate for African American and other communities, which we will learn about in subsequent units over the course of the semester. And additionally, what actually happened during those times where folks were, attacked and faced all kinds of harassment as a result. And although we did have new civil rights laws, which I will cover next time, those things, as we will see, will not ensure people's equality as, kind of thought through or conceptualized through those laws. And then our main key terms for today are Jim Crow, right, or Jim Crow laws, black codes, and then civil rights. So with that, if you have any questions, again, feel free to email me. If not, we'll see you next time.